We're going to talk to a fellow that, quite frankly, I've read a lot of the material that was sent in about him, and I was just discussing it with him and told him, I don't know what the hell he's talking about here, and I don't. I've been around a long time, as all of you know, and I think I've seen almost everything, but as I read some of this, I realize that I don't know everything about everything. Now, I thought I did, but I don't. And we're talking about a scholar, a fellow who is somewhat of a sage, and an individual who consumes epic quantities of well, I'm going to let him tell you about what he consumes epic quantities of. And when he does that, he thinks big about all kinds of issues that we think big about, but I don't consume epic quantities of anything. Some people call him the mushroom man. He believes the world is going to implode. This planet is going to implode, but not right away. In about 20 years, and I may not care about it at that point. 2012, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, we have Terence McKenna. Terence, welcome to KFI. Welcome to my show. Welcome to the Chief Show. I'm glad to have you here, and I'm very, very anxious to hear more about what it is that you consume epic quantities of.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Chief. I guess my reputation comes across as a kind of wild and crazy guy because I've been associated with psychedelic plants and experiences for about 25 years. My exposure to all this was through being a kind of an anthropologist in the Amazon basin, where there are a lot of Aboriginal, non-literate people who have developed, while they haven't developed much science or material technology, they've developed a very sophisticated use of plants. And these societies are regulated by the plants the people use. They do cause visions. They cause hallucinations, all kinds of unusual mental phenomena. And basically my career has been based on writing and talking about this sort of thing because I really think we got a raw deal on it in the 60s. And there's a lot of medical application for this and a lot of social re-engineering that could be done if we could come to terms with these plants with a little different attitude than we've had in the past.
Now, how much time did you spend in the Amazon?
Well, my first trip down there was in 1970, and then there were several trips through the 70s and on into the 80s, and I haven't been back since 82.
Now, you said that all kinds of plants and herbs and et cetera that they have, and really what comes through here in almost all of the material that I've read is the hallucinations, the fact that mushrooms in particular, and I think that's what they were talking about, epic quantities of mushrooms, and you talk about you believe in the Darwinian theory of evolution. You say the apes turned into humans after eating an awful lot of mushrooms. And I'm just paraphrasing some of this.
No, that's right. You see, one of the great embarrassments to evolutionary theory is that it's very hard to explain how we evolved from some kind of a primate or some kind of monkey. The human brain doubled in size in just under 2 million years.
You know, a lot of people don't believe that. You know,
you mean they reject evolution?
Well, they've got a different theory than the Darwinian theory. I mean, they read the Bible and they have a feel for the Bible and believe that that pretty well explains it.
Well, but I'm talking about even among scientists who are gung-ho for evolution. It's a great embarrassment that they're unable to explain the sudden explosive doubling of the human brain size in just under 2 million years. the best theory that we're getting out of the academics would make the big league baseball pitcher the paradigm of evolution, because they're saying to coordinate throwing a small object at about 120 miles an hour through a 3 by 3 foot space 100 feet away, you've got to have a lot of brain power to do that. I find that theory, no matter how big a baseball fan you are, a little inadequate. I think that what we're going to have to look at here is an environmental factor that somehow gave our remote ancestors a leg up in the evolutionary struggle for daily existence. And the interesting thing about psilocybin, which is the chemical that is in many of these psychoactive mushrooms, is that at doses so low that you can't tell you've taken anything, they've done experiments with people, and you have an increased ability over your normal ability to detect edges moving and motion. This would be tremendously important to a hunting animal. If there were a plant in the environment that was the equivalent of a pair of chemical binoculars, then those animals that use that plant are going to have a better and more dependable food supply than their competitors, and they're going to outbreed them, and they're going to replace them. And I think looking at chemicals like this in the environment for clues to how we changed from some kind of a monkey into a civilization with a worldwide electronic network, vast databases, instruments hurled outside the solar system. I understand why people stick with their Bibles. It's a pretty tall order to coax that kind of a transformation out of a monkey. And yet, if you believe what science is telling us, this in fact happened. And I think the missing link is psychoactive plants in the early human environment.
That's interesting. I think, of course, those who believe in the Bible will tell you that it's all very, very clear there. You simply have to believe, and if you do believe it, and there's a lot of scientists who really believe not in the evolutionary theory, but they believe that it's the true word comes out of the Bible, and and that you're never going to find that missing link. So it's interesting that you suddenly have believed or suddenly have come up with this theory. Maybe not suddenly. Maybe you've done this over a long period of time.
It took a while. Actually, in my first book, Food of the Gods, I used the Bible as an argument for some of the points I was trying to make, because if you go back and look at the story of Adam and Eve from a little different perspective, I think what we've got here is the story of history's first drug bust.
Maybe it was a mushroom and not an apple.
Well, whatever it was, the landlord broke the lease. The young lady corrupted her roommate, and everybody got kicked out of paradise and had to work for a living.
We haven't gotten back there yet, have we?
That's what I'm here to preach. I think the way back has to do with recovering this prehistoric habit of using psychoactive plants essentially to build community. These tribes were almost like a single mind. The ego as we know it didn't exist, and these people were just like you and me in terms of their physical appearance, their brain capacity, and perhaps for as long as 500,000 years they built no cities, had no armies, had a very respectful relationship to their environment. And I think our social style, which relies on science and urban populations and standing armies and politics prosecuted at the end of the gun, is a maladaptive style that arose when this, you could almost say, mushroom-driven paradise collapsed. And the story of Adam and Eve is the story of this moment of transition when the mushrooms, for reasons that we could talk about, became unwelcome and probably unavailable, and the style of civilization that we're all familiar with began to suppress that.
Well, do you consume these psychedelic mushrooms?
Well, I do when I have the opportunity. I mean, I'm so busy now with all these books that I do it far less often than I think is probably healthy. But in the past, I have certainly done it, and I'm familiar with the effects of most other psychoactive compounds. I think if you're a scientist, you have a responsibility to actually experience what you're studying. Anthropology, if you're not going to join in the activities of the people you're studying, turns into a fairly sterile kind of voyeurism.
Well, we're going to get right back to that because it is exceedingly interesting. I'd like to make a little bit of a comparison going back to the Timothy Leary days, and he was saying many of the same things back in the 60s about LSD and some of the other drugs. And I'm going to get back to that, but we're going to have to go to a guy who I hope has not been munching on mushrooms, but he's got to give us a clear view of what's happening in traffic. Mark Bennett.
And you noticed how great the traffic was for you today, Chief.
Hey,
you tried to keep it that way for you.
It was neat.
All right, in this report... Hey, now's your chance to talk to the Chief at 1-800-767-4KFI and locally at 520-1KFI. And now, back to the Chief on KFI AM 640 for stimulating talk radio.
And this is the Chief, and we're back, and it's also your chance to talk to Michael McKenna, our guest here.
Terence McKenna.
Terence McKenna. I was thinking about Michael Clark in the newsroom, and by God, it's Terence McKenna. He's a guy who's spent some time in the Amazon and has looked at what is taking place there, looking at some of the herbs and plants, and particularly mushrooms. They call him the Mushroom Man. I don't know why. We were going to talk about some of the same things I heard back in the 60s. A guy by Timothy Leary. He kind of a Pied Piper, leading college kids down the path of, take these drugs. LSD in particular was his big thing, and he said that it sharpens your perception. Some of the things you said just now sharpens your perception. You see things better. You see things more clearly, and most of the scientific tests that I have ever read, they found that no, it does not. As a matter of fact, it does just the opposite. How do you compare that time with your time? Or is there
there's some kind of a comparison to be made. I mean, the 60s, I think, was complicated by two things. First of all, there was a war being fought that was very controversial. And then the other thing that makes LSD...
Talking about Vietnam War.
Yeah. And then the other thing that makes LSD unique is... if you're a first-year biochemistry student and your roommate has a trust fund, you can make 6 million doses of LSD in your apartment in a long weekend if you know what you're doing. 6 million doses of a hallucinogenic drug is automatically a social problem, a problem for the police, the government. That means you're not interested in getting you and your friends high. You're interested in making a fortune in illicit drugs. With mushrooms, if a person were to work like a dog for 6 months, they'd be lucky to produce a couple of thousand hits. So I think the hysteria of the 1960s was based on the fact that LSD physically is a unique drug. So much can be made in an underground situation that it then creates pyramids of criminal activity, and a whole bunch of people get all excited. I think it's much better to sort of move with a little stealth and care and consideration, and also maybe it wasn't the best strategy to target the 18 to 21-year-old segment of the population.
By the way, you lecture at colleges now?
Rarely, but occasionally.
Or you don't lecture too often at with kids? You talk to kids about any of this?
I talk to kids if they come to my lectures, which are usually at growth centers like Esalen or someplace like that. But my audience is pretty broad demographic and age spread. It isn't a children's crusade.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the growing of these mushrooms. How
Yes.
difficult is that, and how do you do it?
Well,
And let me just ask this question. I think I know the answer, but my audience doesn't. What are you talking about, a mushroom? Are you talking about the kind that you get at the market?
Well, no, you're talking about a near relative of the kind you get at the market. The difference being that these psychoactive mushrooms create psilocybin for some reason in their bodies. And psilocybin is a very powerful hallucinogenic, much more hallucinogenic than LSD. LSD makes your mind race, you have all kinds of ideas, you have energy, it's all over the map. Psilocybin, done as I advocate doing it, which is in silent darkness with a great deal of care and attention, is almost pure visual activity behind closed eyelids. In other words, you sit in darkness and you see a Niagara of visual imagery. It can be horrifying, it can be exalting, but what's so interesting about it is none of it seems to be your own. It isn't your memory. It seems to as though we're tapping in here to a portion of the human psyche that most people have very little experience with.
Well, I noticed in some of the material that you have written about, you said the mushrooms actually talk to you. What do you mean by that?
Yes, this is one of the hardest things to talk about with people who have not had this experience. I was a skeptic for years, very simply for reasons unknown to science or anybody else. When you take mushrooms, part of the experience is the presence of a voice in your head which converses with you almost like meeting someone you've never met before, but who's very affable and sociable. And this doesn't happen with other hallucinogens. It seems to be a unique characteristic of psilocybin. If psilocybin were legal, we could study this, and who knows, we might learn something about schizophrenia or about how the brain processes language. We don't quite know what to make of this phenomenon.
Now, say you grow some of these mushrooms and you have them, you don't believe in putting them out on a tray when you have a big party and the music's going and people pick them up and bite into them. You don't like the old cookies, the marijuana cookies of yesteryear, and some parties where you have cocaine on the table. You don't go for that.
No, you see, the paradox there, and it's always puzzled me, is if you were to take a drug that you didn't like, then your best strategy for getting it out of your body would be vigorous physical exercise in a large crowd of people. Well, isn't that what goes on in a disco bar? So strangely enough, this social style or recreational style of drug taking, take some drug, go to your favorite disco bar and dance your rear end off, is precisely a strategy for avoiding confronting what this substance can actually do. If you will sit down, shut up, and turn off the lights, then you see what these things are capable of. But people are afraid, people like the context of social drug taking, and so they miss the point.
Okay,
certainly in the Amazon.
We're going to get back to that. We're going to get back to that, but right now, Michael Clark. Michael, you have not been chewing on mushrooms?
Not today.
Okay, you can see clearly what's happening in our news?
Every word.
Michael Clark, KFI News Center.
Thanks, Chief. Here are the stories we're following. Arson investigators say the fire at the Colt compound near Waco was set from inside. The findings support the Fed's claims that the Branch Davidians set the fire. Some of the Branch Davidians arrested afterwards claim the fire started when the ATF began to ram the compound. Can we all just get along?
Chief Gates on KFI AM 640 for stimulating talk radio.
This is the Chief, and we're back, and we're going to let you talk to a very interesting guy, Terence McKenna. He has finished a book called True Hallucinations, the untold story of his radical and riveting adventures in search of all kinds of things that he talks about. He's done other books, but I guess this is the new one out.
This is the new one. It's the story of a trip to the Amazon 20 years ago with my brother trying to track down some of these hallucinogenic plants.
We were talking about the difference between LSD and mushrooms. We were talking about mushrooms being far more difficult to cultivate, grow, and where LSD, and I know what you're talking about, is not... I've seen a lot of chemistry majors in college put the LSD together and go to jail for it. And now we've got mushrooms, don't have as many. You wouldn't put them out. You say in order to really enjoy and get the benefit out of the mushrooms, you have to sit in the dark and think about, I assume, whatever you're going to think about.
Whatever's on the agenda.
Whatever's on the agenda. Let me ask you that. Do you have an agenda when you take a hit from a mushroom? And how many mushrooms does it take to get started?
I recommend people take about 5 dried grams, which is surprising to some people because that's a fairly stiff dose. One of the things
it says you take prodigious amounts, sir.
Well, prodigious amounts, I don't know. 5 dried grams is the full spectrum of effects of psilocybin. I think people get into a lot of trouble by taking too little when they decide.
You do this in the dark, do you lock the doors, or
I unplug the phone. I unplug the phone. I make sure there's not going to be any interruption. At times people have asked me about mushrooms. They say, well, if I take it, will I be able to drive? And I want to tell people that shows you don't understand the concept. No, you will not be able to drive in any sense of the word. Your job is to watch and to learn in the dark.
I'm off a cliff.
That's right.
That's what it'll do for you. And we're going to talk to some of the folks out there that want to talk to you. We're going to talk to Candace in Lancaster. Candace, welcome to KFI.
Hi, Chief. This is the first time I've ever tuned in, and this is hysterical. I'm sorry, this is so funny. I can't believe this guy is for real.
He's sitting here. He's for real. He's got
I've got this idea of exactly what he looks like in my mind. He's very, very mellow, very calm, and it's hysterical. And my point is that I really feel in order to see things clearly, I don't need any drug. I don't need any chemical in my body to see things clearly. And I just feel that when you had stated the comment of the hysteria of the 60s regarding mushrooms or anything else, I just feel that right now we are reaping the consequences of the hysteria of the 60s.
Reaping that whirlwind, you betcha. That's one of the homeless problems with the homeless.
Oh, yeah.
So many of the social problems that we have today.
Yeah, and look at, the children, the kids now that are teenagers who parents, were raised in the hippie time and stuff. It is really frightening.
Terence, you don't recommend this to kids?
No.
No, I don't recommend this to kids. I think we are reaping the whirlwind of the 60s if what you're talking about is drugs. We have a lot of drug problems in society, but I maintain this is a failure of education and a failure of legislation.
But how are you going to educate someone on taking something that's not, mushrooms, I don't care where you get it from, they're not natural. When I went through a drug period in my teens, we used to take mushrooms, but we didn't sit in the dark.
Candace, you didn't take mushrooms.
Yeah,
no, you didn't. You're too smart.
I'm a rebound person. And, I want to tell you something. Instead of studying mushrooms in the Amazons, maybe you need to go to Jerusalem and study the anthropology and the truth and the fact of the Bible and the artifacts found.
Candace, thanks for the call. I really appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye.
So much. Thanks. Keep listening, Candace. Candace has a point. I just came back from the ocean. I spent the weekend there, and I don't need anything, man. I can sit there and look at that ocean and see the changes. I can feel the sun. I can feel the warmth. I can feel life. I don't need any of that junk. Now, why do you believe that this is something that people should do to enjoy life or to get some answers?
Well, I'm not so sure about enjoy life. I think get some answers. I actually did put my time in Jerusalem. I'm fairly familiar with Kabbalism. I spent time studying it in Jerusalem. My point is, when you're there sitting at the beach enjoying the sunlight and the waves, you're not having sex either. But that's no reason to exclude sex from your life. In other words, my notion is, we're on this world for a very brief amount of time. Who knows what it's really for? And you have a whole bunch of buttons: the sexual button, the intellect button, the potential for intoxication on everything from alcohol to psilocybin. My attitude toward life is to explore it, top to bottom, side to side. And I've been very fortunate in this. It hasn't proven destructive to me. I'm very upset with the idea that people will go from birth to the grave without ever having a psychedelic experience. That seems to me like having a Mercedes your whole life and never pressing that button in the center dash and finding out what the hell it does. I mean, life is to be lived. All of it. The sitting by the ocean, the psychedelic experiences, whatever. We shouldn't put barriers between ourselves and experience.
Well, maybe we should. But anyway, we're going to have to go to a guy who looks clearly at the traffic. Mark Dennis is going to tell us about it.
And, Chief, that's because we have this very high-resolution video graphics monitor here, the only one in town. Now let's get back to the Chief on KFI AM 640, more stimulating talk radio.
And this is the Chief, and we're talking to Terence McKenna, the author of True Hallucinations, a book out very recently by Harper in San Francisco. And is it doing well?
It's doing well as far as we can tell. It's just been out a couple of weeks, but it seems to be doing very well.
Okay. And we have Jeff on here that was going to ask us, apparently he has used mushrooms, and he's wondering whether or not there are any dangers to this.
Well, I think if you do it as I suggested it, stay away from automobiles, stay in your apartment, and that sort of thing, the main danger is of a panic attack, that the dose is for some reason stronger than the person expected, or the phenomenon has dimensions to it which are unsettling. Panic attack, I think, is a potential problem. In terms of long-term physical dangers, the record is pretty clear that there's not a problem. There are people in central Mexico who've been taking these things, populations for thousands of years, no detriment there. I think if people will stay in their houses and do these things in a responsible and focused manner, then they're going to be all right. Someone once said to me, the only danger from psilocybin is death by astonishment. So if you're worried about that, maybe you better steer clear.
Well, now, you talk about, there is a lot of talk right now about the war on drugs, the fact we're losing that war. A lot of wimps out there who think we ought to back away from that war. I heard a judge on John and Ken's show the other day. Supposedly, I always talk about being a conservative judge. He's a wimp in my judgment, talking about legalizing drugs, the worst kind of thing that we can do, because it sends a message to our kids. And I want to make it really clear here, Terence, because we've been talking. And you do not think this is something that the kids ought to pick up and do as a regular kind of thing?
No, I don't think kids should be doing any drug particularly, but I would say about the drug problem, in my opinion, the fact that alcohol and tobacco are legal proves that we can absorb the social consequences of legalizing any drug. We have already legalized the most destructive drug we know, alcohol, and the most addictive drug we know, tobacco. Every society seems to choose out of about 30 or 40 options, 2 or 3 drugs which it proclaims as its drugs, and then to furiously suppress.
The same argument, and I think it's a lousy argument. You're a very bright guy. I think it's a lousy argument. They always throw in the cigarettes. I hear that from the doctor who's on just before me, cigarettes and alcohol. And I understand that's a tremendously destructive pair of drugs, both alcohol and cigarettes. It's done tremendous damage to our population. But it just seems to me that it's idiotic to say, well, since we've legalized these two drugs, we ought to open it up to all the other drugs. That is just a very, very poor argument, in my judgment.
But if that seems idiotic to you, then your position should be that we should make alcohol and tobacco illegal. That would be the
times in this nation when alcohol was illegal, we have been a better nation. We have had less crime, less social problems. It has been a better time for us in this nation. People can't remember that because they think back to Prohibition. They talk about the gangsters and all of that. But it was the lowest level of street crime, lowest level of violent crime in this nation's history. It's not a bad idea, except there's a big difference here. You talk about your mushrooms. You go into a dark room and you get on this big trip. All these hallucinations. I can have a beer, and I don't have a single hallucination. Matter of fact, what I want to do is go to sleep, but no hallucinations whatsoever. I can have a martini, no hallucinations, and most people are like that. It's a matter of moderation, but when you take drugs, particularly the hallucinogenics, there is no moderation. None. Zero.
Well, I would disagree. I think that you can, in the confines of your home, explore these states and be on time for work the next morning, and society has not suffered.
But at that time, you are not in control. You have no control whatsoever of yourself. While you're under these drugs, you already said you better make sure you're great care when you consume the mushrooms and in a dark room. And it's the same thing with LSD. It's the same thing with marijuana. You take marijuana to get drunk. That's what you take marijuana for.
The problem is, Chief, that we don't have a consistent policy here. We tell our children drugs are bad, and then they see drugs being consumed throughout society. We legalize some drugs, we make others illegal. I'm of the opinion that if cannabis were legal, wouldn't we be in a better position if every alcoholic were a pothead?
We're gonna go to a traffic break. What do you think, Mark? Should every alcoholic be a pothead?
Not during my shift.
Okay, Mark.
All right, Chief. A mystery report from the KFI Traffic Center. And now back to the man who can legally speed on the freeway. It's the Chief, Chief Gates on KFI AM 640. More stimulating talk radio.
No speed here. Mushrooms. We're going to go right to the telephones. We're going to talk to Mike in Studio City. Welcome to KFI, Mike.
Thank you, Chief. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Got a question for Terence?
Yeah, Terence, did you, in all your academic work, because I'm an academician myself, take into account the fact that, for example, during the opium wars in China, one of the big issues was you were adding an additional drug to a society that was already overloaded, and the Indian opium was very, very strong, stronger than the Chinese opium, and it really knocked them for a loop. Why the imperial dynasty went against the importation of that stuff. It caused the kind of, shall we say, fallback to anarchy that perhaps you're glorifying as the fallback to the original Garden of Eden. But when you take in the scale and size and the numbers of society, we need organization, and civilization requires a certain amount of coercion, and it seems as if the 1960s mentality that you're running here is countercourse and counterproductive for a new generation of kids who are willing to experiment.
Well, the opium wars in China, people forget that what the issue there was the British wanted to sell opium in the free ports of China, and the imperial government told them to get lost, and so they sent gunboats and forced the Chinese to accept the sale of opium. Now, the reason the English were interested in doing that is that the tea trade had collapsed, and they had all these ships standing idle, and they had the idea that they could grow opium in Goa in India and recoup their losses. So in less than 100 years, what drug wars has meant has changed from a government forcing another government to let it deal opium to a war on citizens who freely choose to exercise their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If the pursuit of happiness doesn't cover a citizen's right to self-experiment with psychoactive compounds, then it's a little hard to understand what it means. The answer to this drug thing is 3 words: education, education, education.
Well, I heartily agree with the need to educate our people, and that's one of the reasons that we push the DARE program in our schools, drug abuse resistance education with our kids, because the kids need to know how to say no to drugs, and there's so much more I'd like to talk to you about. Naturally, we have a built-in disagreement here in terms of what we ought to do in terms of legalizing drugs in this nation. My view is that we can win this war, and I will tell you this: I think we'll win the war principally through education, but I think also we have to send out a very, very strong message that in our society, that if we all choose to do what is best for us in the pursuit of our own individual happiness, we're going to have a real serious problem. We'll never be able to dig ourselves, and we'll probably hope that, as you point out, that in 20 years the Earth will implode. It probably will. Hey, thanks very much for being here. It is the top of the hour. This is KFI 640 AM, where you get more stimulating, not from mushrooms, more from talk, more stimulating talk radio.